Throughout the 20 years I've been an activist, taxes have always been a hot button issue. And for the most part, it's been about pushing back on tax cuts and about defending the services that would be hurt by those cuts. You know, our opponents have had it real easy. The message has been more money in your pockets, while we've had the chore of explaining all the things we would lose, all the very important things we would lose if taxes get cut. And that has been a difficult road to wander as an activist. When we have been able to talk about progressive tax changes, oftentimes the audience has been very, very limited to those who are already politically engaged. But I think that that's starting to shift now. I think now we're starting to see, with growing gaps in income and wealth and fear that many people have that they're just treading water or falling behind as life is becoming more expensive, an appetite for raising taxes on the wealthy in many of our countries. I think we've seen this appetite grow in the fact that there's popular hashtags now called tax the rich, and many proposals for taxes on the wealthy are getting serious airtime around the world, both in Canada and the US, as well as Europe and other places. The public now are pushing in the opposite direction on taxes for the first time in decades. And today we're going to dig into what it's like to campaign on taxing the wealthy right now, and distill some learnings from those who've been on the front lines of those debates. And we're going to start first by taking a deep dive into what I think is a thrilling new campaign kicked off in the state of New York called the Invest in Our New York campaign. I'd like to invite my guests from that campaign to join me on screen now if they can. Hi, everyone.
Hi,
Great
how
to
are
have
you,
you here.
Katrina?
Let me give some quick introductions of who's with us here. I've got Sochie Nnaemeka, who's the state director for the New York Working Families Party. Hello, Sochie. Nice to see you.
Hi, Katrina.
You know, Sochie, you've had a deep and diverse organizing background, which is a good thing because you took over as the New York State Director for the Working Families Party in January 2020, right before all of this last year hit. And I understand that you've had to steer the endorsing and supporting of electing dozens of candidates throughout the turmoil of last year. It's got to have been quite a big ride for you, I imagine.
It was a challenging year for all of us, but what was exciting is that COVID was such a clarifying moment for voters, and it really pushed forward an opening for the type of politics that we are so invested in, and what we're going to talk about soon, investing and closing tax breaks on the most wealthy.
That's great. Yeah, it's true. And I have with us also Rebecca Baillin, who's the campaign director for the Invest in Our New York campaign. And prior to this campaign, Rebecca was actually the political director for Riders Alliance, where she led a number of campaigns to improve transit service and lower fares for low-income riders. I hold deep personal gratitude for transit activists and have my whole life as a transit user. So I appreciate your past work, and I can't wait to hear about your current work. I'm really excited to have you joining us as well.
Thank you so much, and really excited to be here with Sochie and the senator, when she's able to join us.
Yeah, and I'll explain that in a second. We have a couple of adjustments that we need to make. Let me explain first. Senator Ramos is right in the middle of a Senate hearing that was actually moved on her to this slot. And so she's going to try to join us. It's a very important hearing on the budget. So she's in the midst of trying to get money for her community for the things that they need. She represents the 13th district in New York, which is a big part of Queens. And chairs the Senate Committee on Labor, where she's already passed historic legislation on workers' rights. She's also leading a bill in the legislature right now to tax the unrealized capital gains on the state's 118 billionaires. I just still can't quite get over that number, 118 billionaires, which would raise about 5.5 billion. So we know that she's really busy, and we're hoping that we're going to see her in that window soon enough. But let's go ahead and get started. We also have Sochie, who's had a change in your schedule, a conflict rise in your schedule. So I know we only have you for about 15 more minutes. So I want to kick it right off and get you to talk for a little bit about the Working Family Party. And my understanding is that what I see from the work that you do is that the party really excels in building movement-based power and translating that into electoral wins that then result in great policy change. I want you to take a couple of minutes and talk about how the Working Family Party, particularly in New York, interacts with campaigns like Invest in Our New York campaign and the value you see in those efforts and the type of work you do.
Wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Katrina and the Broadbent Institute. We are so happy to be a long-term partner of yours and to really explore this critical issue that we're all battling with, struggling with as progressives, how to actually invest in the public good, how to raise taxes on those who are benefiting most from this economic system that leaves too many of us behind. So I'm really glad we're able to talk. And please excuse us, we're literally in the middle of budget session in this moment, racing before the April 1st deadline. So a lot going on here, but so happy to start and talk a little bit about the party, who since 1998, the party has been running candidates against corporate Democrats in primaries and electing progressives for open and contested seats in New York, right? And in this process, we have shown that not all Democrats are the same, right? That there actually are real ideological cleavages between them that affect policy differences that impact real people, working people's lives. We have always positioned ourselves as a pro-investment, anti-austerity party and played a lead role in delivering the state's first millionaires tax in 2009. And so the Invest in Our New York campaign, which Rebecca will speak to more, is a campaign to end tax breaks on the wealthy in order to invest in the public good. And it's a WFP priority that is not separate from our electoral priorities, right? It is not a legislative campaign that runs parallel or, an off cycles of our electoral work. It is a direct expression of the electoral energy that we build to turn that into a governing agenda that our winning candidates are moving on. You'll hear from Senator Ramos later, who is a candidate who came in at a critical sea change moment that is making more progressive legislation more possible. And that electoral energy turning into governing power is central to the party's theory of change. How we do it, I think first we win races that shift the balance of power. We threw out the IDC, which is a group of turncoat Democrats who caucused privately with the Republicans in Albany in order to center corporate interests. We sent a new cohort of unapologetically progressive leaders like Jessica Ramos to replace those turncoat Democrats, and then unleashed a torrent of progressive legislation last year. It also created the conditions for us to dig even deeper and put out an even bolder plan to reshape our whole taxation structure in the Invest in Our New York Act. Second, we run ideologically grounded campaigns. We don't just run candidates. So whether it's that we're running folks who are clearly running against the real estate industry or talking about the transformational power of prosecutors and ending mass incarceration. Last year, we ran on a pro-investment, pro-wealth tax platform. And our candidates up and down the state, whether it is in predominantly Black communities in the Rockaways or in rural communities upstate, we're running on taxing the wealthy. And as I mentioned before, COVID had such a clarifying effect actually for voters, right? Our healthcare system completely fell apart. Schools were kept open because it was the only way that children could be guaranteed a meal over the course of the day. Millions of our neighbors lost their jobs. And so, and in this moment, those 116 or 18 billionaires you spoke about, we're getting wealthier. We're actually profiting off of the pandemic and getting wealthier in real time. And so that deep immoral disconnect did catalyze a lot of electoral energy and did capture a huge wave of voter turnout last year. We had immensely high voter turnout, even despite pandemic voting, and people were calling for actual government investment in a year in which the government was demonstrating a quite large disregard for how everyday people are going to get through the pandemic, as they were protecting corporations and extending corporate immunity to nursing homes, et cetera. Working people were not feeling cared for. And so we're pairing our invest narrative with a tax narrative. We need to tax because wealth is being hoarded, because we have been subsidizing the wealthy for generations, and we need to invest because our social safety net, as we felt so acutely during the COVID crisis, has completely frayed. We have to invest in our education, in our school, in our transit, in housing, in food access, just throughout New York State. This austerity mindset that has been pushed forward by Democrats for many years, right? This neoliberal agenda that Democrats have been holding central to their platform has been creating a huge divide within New York State. And so the party thinks and sees this values-based and strategic alignment integrated program with elected officials who want to be part of the movement as key to us turning those electoral victories into a real governing agenda, into a real state in which we're investing in those who keep our state running. And we know we can't simply run candidates. So we want to forge deep alignment with those in the legislature and be real co-conspirators on the outside and on the inside to deliver that mandate for the people. And that's what the Invest in New York Act is. How do we work on the outside to build the excitement, the energy, the moral demand, and work on the inside to match that with bold, transformative policy that ensures that we're shifting the balance of power in our state and making New York a place where working people can actually thrive.
That's it's amazing work to think about, and the complexity of the work, I think, is quite remarkable because as I understand it, and we'll hear more from Rebecca in a second. I just want to take the last few minutes I have with you to gather some of this. The legislators, both the assembly people and the senators right now, who are on the inside of the legislature proposing the bills as part of this campaign that also has an outside game, as we would say, of movement builders who are building that support and that pressure on the outside, are actually working family party candidates, a lot of them, who got elected into legislature and are now activating that agenda, and are also fueling other candidates, because I think you're walking into an election fairly soon, if I'm not mistaken. So we're we're seeing this in the middle of that cycle that the Working Family Parties works between making sure that you have value-based campaigns and candidates who match that, and that helps them get into office and then create that change at a legislative level.
Absolutely. We have a holistic approach to this, right? No lane is separate from the other. So right now, as the legislature is negotiating this budget package, we have, candidates running for mayor of New York City who are lifting up the package and running and saying, we as New York City mayoral candidates know that there's no way we can run the city unless we change our tax system, unless we raise taxes on the wealthy. So even though they have no lever to change the taxation structure, they recognize that voters sent the state legislators to Albany the prior cycle on that pro-investment, anti-austerity mission and platform. And so candidates, there's reverberations in all races across the state where candidates are almost competing to be clearer and clearest about their anti-austerity stance. I think that is what's important, that the whole kind of wraparound ecology and narrative around investment in the public good as being our only ethical and moral growth strategy is a necessary one. And then the accountability and the co-governance is able to be built off of that, right? We are saying to those who've been elected now, like, now is not the time to retreat. You won on this wave. We're going to hold you not only accountable to it, but we're going to be co-conspirators in making sure that you can champion these bills, right? Our electeds are not simply our community's avatars, to go forward. They have to see themselves in the struggle and understand that it's their role to deliver and to think about how do we grow the pie even more? How do we build our base even greater so that we can win, bigger gains the next round? We know that this is a multi-year campaign, as Rebecca will speak to. We need to fill our budget needs now. We need to increase taxes. And then the next go around, we have to really take a strike at the whole structure that is leaving our communities depleted. And so to win on that kind of multi-cycle mode, we have to do the deeply integrated work. We have to do the inside and outside strategy, and we have to grow our base of people who are calling clearly with that demand that we have to invest in our communities.
That's, all of this is such powerful insights for us here in Canada. We have a minority federal government, which, could fall at any time. And certainly we expect, there's been lots of talk of an election coming within the next few months. So I think that a lot of activists who are tuning in today are wondering how to take what we see as great public appetite and energy around taxing the wealthy, particularly to pay for the investments we want in things like pharmacare and childcare and good education and affordable housing, some of the same things that your campaign is talking about, how to take that into the ballot box and make that a real issue during the election. And so thank you so much for sharing that story with me. Sochie, I know that that you need to go worry about New York's budget right now. We're gonna say goodbye to Sochie for now. And I would love to invite Rebecca to tell us more about this amazing campaign. I would really like you to spend a couple of minutes, Rebecca, walking us through what the Invest in Our campaign is set out to do and how it came to be, and really what's at stake right now for you. I mean, this is this is by the minute here because we're in the middle of the budget. So, this could change as you speak. I'm not really sure, but why don't we go ahead and move to you, Rebecca, and give us a sense of what the campaign is.
Yeah, absolutely. But first, I would really love to just say thank you to Sochie and to Senator Ramos for fighting so hard for this and taking time to speak to folks when they're so busy, just trying to get stuff done and get wins for our communities. So the Invest in Our New York campaign.
I was just going to say more power to both of them. So appreciative to have Sochie with us, and hope that Jessica can join us for a bit, but understand the challenges of the day.
And I'm grateful to be working with them. So the Invest in Our New York campaign is a campaign fighting for 6 bills. As you mentioned, they would raise $50 billion for the state if passed. They fall under 3 main categories: taxes on high incomes, taxes on wealth, and taxes on big businesses and corporations. And actually, it's not even so much taxes on the rich. Of course it is, but it's really about ending tax breaks that the wealthy have enjoyed and the rest of us don't. So this is a campaign of 170 coalitions, over 170 coalitions statewide. And while, of course, we need our federal government to pass taxes on the wealthy, but New York State can actually do its part and take care of its community members. So we actually launched this iteration of the campaign in January. There have been many different versions of the Tax the Rich effort, but this one is really historic, not only because of the amount of organizations that are part of the coalition, but also because of the fact that we're all pushing for bills that aren't what we call earmarked. So we're not fighting for a bill that goes to education or a bill that goes to housing, but rather all 170 organizations are prioritizing major taxes on the wealthy because all of our issues are interconnected, and we're sick of being told that we should just fight each other, fight for scraps, and survive and thrive. I don't know if I should stop there and let you ask me more questions. I could always go on.
Just ask you could continue on. I love that message. So oftentimes we've hit budget processes in the movements that I've been involved in, and it's, well, do you want this or do you want that? Because we can only, and it's this myth of scarcity that we've been convinced of for so long. And I think that the tables have now turned, and I really see that in the Invest in Our New York campaign, that idea of, Sochie spoke about being co-conspirators. And I think that's part of it, that solidarity around not allowing our asks to be turned against each other. Can you give us a sense of, I was sort of shocked when I saw how many organizations were involved in this campaign, as well as how many legislators were involved in this campaign. Just give us a sense of that breadth.
Yeah, I mean, we have support. So typically, you usually get your support in New York City. Not such a surprise there. It's definitely more seen as more of a progressive part of the state. But thanks
Mhm.
to Working Families Party's efforts and other efforts, we now have progressive legislators across the state who are fighting for this. So we have support in Rochester, in Albany, in Long Island, where I grew up in part. By the way, I also grew up in Canada, so I've got a little bit of both. And so we really do have support both organizationally and from elected officials across the state. And it's not just our newer, even more progressive legislators. It's legislators who have been in office for quite some time who are also realizing that, COVID created the multi-crisis of education. Of job losses, healthcare, economic crisis. But it was exacerbated because we have not been properly funding our state. We probably could
Mhm.
have addressed a lot of these issues if we had done proper funding. So, back to the fact that all these groups are fighting together for the same thing and how intersectional these issues are. If you're hungry, if you can't afford food, you're probably not going to be able to focus at your job. If you're trying to get to work, you need good transportation. So it's all
Mhm.
really, really interconnected. And we're really excited to have this kind of solidarity and unity among the legislators and among
Mhm.
our organizations. And right now, it's really up to our legislators to deliver this year with tens of billions of dollars.
It's an amazing campaign. I want to invite our last speaker to come in as well and join us in this conversation, Rebecca. Toby, if you could join us on screen now, I'll be happy to introduce you into the conversation. And many folks will know this face. It's a very familiar face for those of us in Canada. Toby Sanger is the director of the Canadians for Tax Fairness and has been since October 2018. But prior to that, he was the chief and only economist at Canadian Union of Public Employees, the National, and was the chief economist for the Yukon government, advisor for the Ontario Ministry of Finance. You have a long and valued career, Toby, in talking about the economy from a progressive space, particularly talking about it from a space that looks at things like taxes as a good thing. Potentially, it raises some good revenue for all of us. And so I know that you've been able to see how the conversation has shifted. Hearing what we're hearing now from Invest in Our New York campaign. Could you spend a couple of minutes just talking about what you see as what's evolved or changed in terms of the advocacy work around taxes from a, oh, wait, hold on, hold the phone, Toby. I apologize. we have to use the senator while we have her.
That's great.
Senator Ramos,
Hi.
welcome. I'm so glad you could
Hi,
join us for a
hi.
little bit.
Yeah, no, my name's Jessica Ramos. Sorry about the back and forth. We are in the middle of state senate conference, precisely having the conversation about how to generate revenue for our state. So I'm fully focused and in there, really trying to, coordinate with our colleagues and really push for the best possible deal for working people in New York State. So I'm a little back and forth. I'm at one of my staff members' desks. So I apologize even for the background noise.
That's all right. We are just so happy to have you join us for a little bit. We've been having a great conversation. Sochie joined us for the first part of it, really walked us through, that evolution that the Working Family Parties has around helping really progressive candidates that are based on advocating in value-based campaigns. To positions like yours right now, where you get to make actual legislative change. So the fact that that is happening at this moment is kind of perfect for the story we're talking about. I actually, if you feel that you have your thoughts put together enough, I'd love for you to spend a couple of minutes talking about the assembly persons and senators group behind these proposed 6 bills in the legislature. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what you're up against politically and the strength that you can gather by all of you working together on these 6 bills as a package.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question, Katrina. A lot of people, of course, often feel that politics doesn't matter and that elections don't matter. What we're witnessing in New York is the direct result of us working as communities of color, as struggling communities, being able to work within the space that the Working Families provides for us in order to not only change the outcome of who gets elected, and what the value set that the platform of those candidates represents, but now once we're in office, being able to stand strong in our progressive values and legislating from a place that really does improve economic outcomes, health outcomes, education outcomes for our communities. So I guess really this is it in action. We are with the WFP and so many of our other allies fighting for a budget that moves away from the austerity that Governor Cuomo has forced us to live under for over a decade now. And we're really hoping to bring much more equity to our personal income tax brackets here in New York State, and really demand that the wealthiest among us are paying their fair share in several ways, because unfortunately the way the state has been run up until now has really been a playground for the rich, and this is why there's so much food insecurity. There are so many families on the verge of eviction. There are many more unemployed. And this is by design. This is not by accident. Had we strengthened our social safety nets, we would have been able to cope and manage through a crisis, an unprecedented and unplanned, an unexpected crisis such as this one. And I hope we really do learn this lesson. We know scientifically that there's a possibility of more viruses coming about due to deforestation, and just further urbanization of our natural habitats. And so this is those places where the intersectionality of all of these issues really come into play, and we need to turn around and redesign the system that has been keeping so many working families oppressed for such a long time. So I'm really excited about getting this budget done, hopefully the right way.
I think it's really exciting, the work you're doing there. And I curiously saw on the news a couple of days ago, I don't know if this is a change, but is Cuomo starting to crack a little bit on the idea of raising taxes?
That's right. It's been interesting to watch the governor react to allegations of data manipulation on nursing home deaths. And for those who perhaps, haven't been privy to this part of the news, back in March, our governor fudged the numbers, manipulated the data as to how many people were moved into nursing homes without their family's consent. And unfortunately, thousands of them died. There's a federal inquiry. The FBI has also been looking into it, in addition to the Department of Justice. Our Attorney General has already issued a pretty scathing report with regard to this. And as if that weren't enough, now there are several women who have come out raising very serious sexual harassment allegations against our governor, most of them being employees, meaning that the governor has designed a very toxic work environment, and we've also now heard about situations where he has called to bully some of my colleagues, and so I think because of the backlash against all of his wrongdoing, he's starting to come around and express interest in taxing the rich, hopefully understanding that while we're going to get some federal money within the next few weeks, and it will go a long way towards helping New York stay within financial solvency, that money is not going to be here next year. And we're going to have to figure out how to cover that gaping hole. And we would be smart to start raising that revenue now so that we're not in dire straits next year, which incidentally is an election year, and can make things difficult. There is no reason why we shouldn't be taxing those who made a profit from this pandemic while the rest of us lost our loved ones, our homes, our jobs, preventing them from paying their fair share. It's the right thing to do. We've actually already heard many of the most affluent New Yorkers step up to say, there's the patriotic millionaires, there's a few of the billionaires as well, who have expressed interest in paying higher taxes, understanding what their role is in maintaining a better economic climate here in New York, and showing that they understand the value of the dollar. As many dollars as they're hoarding in their bank accounts and in their assets, if that money can't circulate, it's really worth nothing. And so we need to get New Yorkers back to work. We need to support our small businesses. There's a lot of work to do. If it took the governor's truth to come out in order to get him to a place to do the right thing, well, then so be it.
That's as often the case in these campaigns, is whatever gets you there, right? So be it. I'm glad to see that's gained some success for us. Jessica, I know that your time is very, very, very precious today, and so I don't know if you can stay with us. If you can, that's wonderful. I understand if you can't. I'm going to move back to the whole panel now. So that we can involve everyone in the conversation. Hello, everyone again. So I would like to, apologies, Toby, for interrupting you there in order to give Senator Ramos, apologies also Senator Ramos for my mispronunciation of your name before. I want to sort of, open this question, and then Toby, I will come to you, but while we have the Senator, if we still have the Senator, I want to open this question around how we talk about this in the public with people, how we make an issue like taxes that for the most part, as I said when I introduced this, has been an issue that's really been for the politically engaged and the policy nerds of us in the crowd. Make this an issue that is about people's everyday lives. We've heard a bit from both the Senator and from Rebecca and Sochie about the fact that there's more and more sense that people need services that are funded by taxes. People need childcare. They need affordable housing. They need the things that give them the linkages to the good jobs. So what I'd love to do for our audience is just walk through some ways that we talk about this in the public. And whoever would like to start off, please do. Before we start, though, I also want to say to our audience, we are taking questions for the panel in the chat. So in the session chat, if you have a question, please write question and then put your question there so that our chat moderators can clearly see it and they will send it to me. Who would like to take a crack at that? Toby, since you haven't spoken yet, do you want to talk about that for a second, about how we talk? You've been talking about taxes a lot of times. Has your way of talking about taxes changed?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you very much for holding this session. It's so great to hear about the campaigns and that people are engaging in elsewhere, because we all learn from each other on this, and it really strengthens it when people are hearing similar messages, both from different organizations and different groups, but also from around the world on similar issues, because we're fighting some common battles. In terms of some of the messaging that we're finding, I think that we've always found it's important to stress values, and that really moves people. So inequality and fairness really do move people, and even more so in the pandemic. Another area, the Invest in New York campaign is also that very clear connection between the revenue these different tax measures can raise and the services that they can provide in different ways. And that's really important. We've done that in the last election here as well. Another one is how tax cuts have really failed. I mean, we've had corporate tax cuts and cutting taxes for the wealthy have really failed. We've had 2 decades of corporate tax cuts, and the advocates for that keep on just saying, we just need to cut taxes more, or we need to cut our taxes even further because this country has cut their taxes further, and so we need to cut them more. But we've had 2 decades of failure of that. In Canada, it's cost hundreds of billions of dollars, a failed experiment. And it's important to fight back against that and to show that investing in public services that really benefit people is better for the economy, will create more jobs, and is better in that way. So finally, it's actually just in the past week, I mean, it's been amazing kind of to see it. The Conservative Chancellor in the UK committed to raising the corporate tax rate in the UK. Now, he provided other tax cuts in other areas, but he actually basically admitted that this 2-decade experiment in cutting taxes has failed. So those are a number of the messages that seem to work. But I particularly in the pandemic, the fairness issue and the values issue has really moved people. I'd love to hear what others have to say about that too.
Yeah, I want to invite both Jessica Ramos, who's of course off to actually get the money, which is great. Rebecca, could you pipe in a bit on just, and let's keep us all in one screen just so that we can kind of have a back and forth conversation. And I'm also going to raise some questions from the audience now. What does that conversation actually sound like? The Invest in Our New York campaign, if I'm correct, is basically doing one-on-one conversations with people at times about this. What does that conversation sound like with people?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have organizations who are doing on the ground organizing, and that means building power among communities who need the revenue. And it is really hard to talk about, to get people excited about fighting for taxes, right? So it's all about talking about bringing it home and talking about the injustice of the current system, painting a picture of how it could look different, and talking about how the current system really impacts them now. And so what I mean by that is also we need to talk about how somebody is paying right now, right? The state has to be paid for, and it's paid for by working class people, middle class people, and poor folks. And that's in the form of budget cuts, of job losses. That's when we don't have health care if you lose your job, right? Those are the way that we're paying for the state. It's also when certainly now we have lines around the block and food pantries that can't feed New Yorkers because the state isn't giving money that nonprofit and food pantries need to do the job of government to feed New York State residents right now. Those are all taxes in a way. And so when you really point that out and say, you know what, our plan is really about just making sure the right people are paying enough and just simply ending tax breaks for the rich, it's really common sense, it's not punitive. I think that really helps. And then really highlighting folks' stories and asking people to share their stories. So, we have a petition and we've been collecting thousands of New Yorkers' stories, and they're talking about their job losses, the fact that they have to leave their community. Folks aren't leaving, rich people aren't leaving. It's working class and poor New Yorkers and communities of color that are forced to leave their homes all throughout the state because they can't afford to live there anymore. And if you encourage folks to share their stories and then to connect them, do the organizing work of connecting it to what we're fighting for, that's how we do that, and make sure they connect with their legislators, of course.
Yeah, I love what you just said right then around sharing stories. I found it particularly powerful, the idea of sharing stories of people who are being forced out of New York, because I like how it turns the table on this idea, Toby, that we often hear that if you tax wealth, you'll have wealth flight, and this terrible fear of wealth flight, that the wealthy will leave and take all their money with them, and often, and maybe we need to talk a little bit more about other people who are pushed out when the wealthy get to hoard money and not contribute their fair share to a fair society. I just think that's a really interesting dynamic.
Well, and exactly, and some studies have shown that the wealthy are less mobile than poor and working people in that way. So all these threats about you're going to raise taxes and you're going to lose the wealthy just doesn't have a lot of water. I mean, the wealthy like to live in vital, interesting places, and so that fear mongering has really failed. And for some people, they've said, "Fine, go ahead." The billionaires have made life quite a bit less affordable for other people. Earlier, Katrina, you asked like what has evolved or changed in terms of advocacy work on this issue, and I got to say it has been amazing. I mean, tax used to be a 4-letter word. Even some progressives were scared to talk about taxes. They talked about levies, and just recently in Canada, we had a prime minister who said. He actually said, I don't believe any taxes are good taxes. And he didn't have budgets. He had what they called low tax plans for growth. And you compare that to the last election we had from the NDP and to a certain extent from the Greens, some of the most progressive set of tax policies I've seen in decades. And even the anti-tax conservatives included a few measures in their platform. So it's been, this might be obvious, but it's been a game changer having those political parties and prominent politicians like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh prominently and consistently advocate for more progressive taxes, like wealth taxes. And it's also been great to see, there's such strong support. I think that we've seen the same thing in New York. There's strong support for fair and progressive taxes across the spectrum, among all different age groups and even among conservatives. And then the other thing that's been great, I mean, we saw this in the Invest in New York campaign where you've got 170 different groups. In Canada here as well, we're seeing a lot more support for fair and progressive taxes among a lot of groups. And Katrina, you've been doing a fantastic job at the Broadbent Institute, bringing different groups together. We've got environmental groups, we've got tenants groups, we've got children and patriotic millionaires all advocating for more progressive taxes. And so that's been a real game changer. And development organizations, and then the pandemic, it's some expert validation. I mean, part of the interesting thing is also so often we get the message from governments, well, what other countries have got these measures in place that have worked, right? Well, you're not going to necessarily get any progress if everybody acts like that. So it's been great to have some experts also, people like Thomas Piketty, Gabrielle Zuckman, and others as expert validators in terms of pushing the boundary further and pushing for more and progressive taxes that haven't been tried elsewhere.
Yeah, I always feel like the experts, like the London School of Economics, just coming out with a report saying that the tax cuts of the last 4 decades have just grown inequality and haven't helped our economy at all. Are these moments where we say, "See, I told you so"? They're the great thrust and parry of the back and forth, the retorts between us and our opposition. But I wonder. I think that conversation that happens at the door, that Rebecca is talking about how we make this real for people, about the stories we tell in our lives, about what happens when our services disappear, when our jobs stagnate and become unreliable, and those things that happen when we don't have a good base of taxes to support our collective well-being is really, really important. Now, one of the questions we've got from the audience, which I think is really interesting, is, we're dealing in an age, this may have shifted a bit in the pandemic, so please reflect on that, where there's a serious amount of distrust in politicians and in political institutions, potentially amongst a fair amount of the public audience. So how does that impact a conversation around taxes and around taxing the wealthy in order to pay for more public goods through our governments. Rebecca, have you come across that in the campaign? Distrust and that being a barrier?
I actually think that's a question if Sochi's still here.
I don't
Is
think
Sochi still here?
she is. No, that's just
Oh,
a
that's her
beautiful picture.
screensaver. I was just like, wow, she's
Yeah.
really still. Okay, so can you repeat the question? Because I was just assuming
Sure.
that would be a Sochi one.
No, it's sure. It's just the if people are distrustful of politicians and political and public institutions, is that a barrier to saying we should have more taxes, particularly on the wealthy, in order to fund those public institutions and programs? Have you come across that in the campaign? And if so, what's the way over that hump for people?
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's also one I encountered when fighting for public transit funding at my previous job. So when you're talking about levying taxes to bring more money into systems that may not work as well as we'd want them to do, or there's a distrust that that the money will actually go where we believe it needs to go and not places not to or police, for instance. Yeah. I'm going to be honest, that's a real concern, right? When you have a bureaucracy that might not be function as well as it should, or you don't trust that your lawmakers will funnel the money properly, that's a real issue. But what I always say to that is that's where democracy comes in, and this is all about democracy. You have to really lobby and push for that money to go where it needs to go for a functioning, for functioning agencies, and a lot of that still comes down to revenue. Agencies function better when they're not working, as you mentioned earlier, in a scarcity climate where they're able to fund everything they need and use the money appropriately and hire the right people and pay good wages for those people. But it all comes down to continuing to lobby. So that's what I always say, that the work isn't over if we win the revenue. It's only just a really important start to the work that we have to continue doing, electing the right people, pushing once we win that money, lobbying our electeds and the governor, tying the leaders to the issue, right? It's all about political accountability, and that work doesn't stop even when we're tired and even when we've won part of it, and hopefully if we win part of it.
Yeah. I think that what's so amazing about the system that Working Families Party has built is that it sort of answers the question in the way that it works, in the fact that it is about electing leaders who then change that trust, that give trust because they come from the communities and the movements in order to make the changes that people want to see in the government. And so there's a real benefit there. And I think that's, Toby, I think there's lots of activists in Canada who are trying to create that same sort of evolution of electing people who come from movements in order to make the changes, in order to gain the trust that in fact the government is there for the collective good and to have all of our backs. What's your sense of that, Toby?
Absolutely. I mean, the anti-tax and the right-wing anti-tax and anti-government, anti-public services and anti-government campaigners always focus on trying to point out the wastefulness of in different areas of government. And I mean, of course, it's important to make sure the governments run effectively and efficiently in public services, but we also need to demonstrate where those taxes go and the services that they provide. And most Canadians, most people get a good deal from that, from the education, healthcare, and in other areas. And we do have the challenge. I mean, we point out the unfairness of the existing tax system, but we also need to make sure that people don't lose faith or trust in government or society in that way. So there's a bit of a balancing act on that as well. But most importantly, also, most people aren't aware of just how much they do benefit and the value of those benefits from public service. We certainly feel that here in Canada in terms of the healthcare system in many other ways. And so it's important to emphasize those things over and over again.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think there's been some attention to that too during the pandemic, as people have recognized and needed to use services and seen how effective they can be when they work, and seen what happens when they're underfunded and crunched, as our long-term care system has been, as certain parts of our healthcare system have been. I have another question from the audience I think is really interesting, because it belies it belies a reality check potentially. The idea is that the gap between the rich and poor may not be as great in Canada as in other places. So is that one of the drivers for this campaign? And I want to start by saying what's so interesting about this question is actually the Broadbent Institute did a study about 5 years ago, that polled Canadians on how much they thought there was a gap, a wealth gap and an income gap, particularly a wealth gap. And Canadians, for the most part, actually underestimated what the level of the gap was in Canada. The gap is much greater in Canada than most Canadians think it is. So whether it's reality or perception, the truth is most Canadians think we're not doing that bad, when in fact we have a very significant wealth gap, and then of course resulting income gap that's often driven by wealth. And I wonder, Toby, maybe we'll start with you just briefly, kind of speak to that aspect of the Canadian context and the Canadian mindset around that perception. And then Rebecca, it'd be great to talk to the New York perception of that, because New York is also a very rich state. So how much that play exists there as well. Toby, let's start with you quickly.
No, exactly. I mean, Canadians can be a little bit too protective of our billionaires and of our establishment, and I mean, it's partly because they control, to a certain extent, the press. One of the wealthiest families in Canada, controls some of the press in different areas. So we tend to be fairly protective and don't like to focus and single out individuals, but absolutely. I mean, we came out with a study looking at how much billionaire wealth had increased during the pandemic. First 6 months of the pandemic, top billionaires in Canada increased their wealth by 50 billion. Meanwhile, they cut pandemic pay for workers. They and millions were out of work and suffering, going through their savings. So the pandemic has really brought that out in a big way. It also on the corporate side, so much of the corporate wealth, so much of that individual wealth comes from business and corporations. So there's a real connection there. And some the larger corporations are often done better in the pandemic. So I think the pandemic, as Sochie and others have said, has really uncovered a lot of that as well.
Yeah, I think maybe some of the rose-colored glasses have come off a bit. Rebecca, how about you? Do you find that people perceive that gap to be less than it actually is, and it's a little bit of having to take the rose-colored glasses off them?
Yeah, and I fully agree with Toby. I think he made really, really good points. Here, billionaires have actually increased their wealth to $87 billion, while during the pandemic, while the rest of us are either struggling. I think many of us are for the first time experience job insecurity. So people like me, college educated, higher ed, master's degrees, jobs, all these things are for the first time in their adult lives experiencing job insecurity, and they're like, oh wow, this could happen to me. So I think that's actually increasing the support for this kind of thing among folks who are normally a little more economically secure, which I think is an important component. But the other thing is, not to sound too Marxist, but I think we identify with the wealthy. And I think people don't know, and I've heard this a lot, I think people don't actually realize how rich people actually are, which so they think they can imagine it. And the reality is they can't. The wealth is so massive, and which means they also don't realize how little these taxes will actually impact them. And that we're not actually punishing folks for just capturing a little more of that. And then again, not to sound like a broken record, I think it's really important to point out that people are paying. And so I think a framing is often off when we're like, tax the rich, tax the rich. The point is, no, we're paying more than we should be in all these different ways, and they need to pay a little more because it will also barely impact them. I mean, everything I said is not necessarily backed up by data. I'm not a policy wonk, sadly. I'm more of an organizer. But otherwise, I agree with everything Toby said.
I think us who are policy wonks, because I'm sort of split I have a foot in both camps, are happy to have the organizers on part of this, because that's what we've been missing. So really, really thankful to have you. We're just about to wrap up our session now. And I just want to plug a couple of things. There is a Tax the Rich movement in Canada that the Broadbent Institute and the Canadians for Tax Fairness are partnered with a bunch of great organizations: Lead Now, Acorn, CUPE National, Resource Movement, Greenpeace, United Steelworkers of Canada. And those in the audience, please go check out that campaign. It's just kicked off under letstaxtherich.ca. And there's new evidence out today from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives that very, very minor, what you're speaking to, Rebecca, a very modest tax on the ultra rich. And oftentimes we have to say ultra rich to really clarify who we're talking about here, so that people don't suddenly put themselves in that camp, that they understand we're really talking about the 0.2% of people. Just a modest tax on them would raise between 10 and 20 billion dollars every single year, which is pretty amazing for us here in Canada, and would fund a lot of things. So those are really both great things, great movements happening here in Canada. There's great campaigns by all those organizations. Acorn's got a great campaign to close a loophole on real estate income trusts in order to fund affordable housing. And so, we're seeing new things pop up all the time. So let's make sure we continue this conversation. I want to make sure I just give you each a last minute to tell the audience what you think are the most important priorities for advocating for various ways to tax wealth. Is it, talking to your neighbor about it? Is it electing representatives? Maybe it's all the above. Just give me, 45 seconds to a minute of your top priorities to send people away from this conversation with. Rebecca, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So it is both things. We need to talk to our neighbors. We need to talk to them about the issues, talk to them about how it impacts you. But even more importantly, together with your neighbors and your community, we need folks to call their representatives. Yes, it's about voting, but once they're voted in, those representatives, even if they're on your side, need to hear from their constituencies. That we have various tools at investinrny.org for folks to use. You put in your address, you can email and call them. You can also volunteer with the Working Families Party and the Invest in New York campaign, actually, to phone bank and call other New Yorkers and connect them directly with their representatives. Those phone calls and emails from constituents really matter. Also, so do tweets at the governor and the Senate and Assembly leadership. Even our amazing Senator Jessica Ramos, who wanted me to apologize, she is, as she said before, literally debating this budget right now, trying to bring major wins for our communities as we speak. So she could not be here for the end. But even she needs to hear from her constituents so that she can go back and say, I'm hearing from my constituents. So it really matters.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Rebecca. Last 45 seconds, Toby, what's the most important thing for people to walk away from here and do?
Absolutely, I totally agree with Rebecca on this. I mean, as the other side has got the money. Cutting the Canadians for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, which is all about cutting taxes, has got 30 times the budget that we have. We've got the power of people, and that really can have an impact. But people need to mobilize. They need to, as Rebecca said, send in tweets, sign petitions, write into your MP or your MLA, to your elected representatives. Get involved. We put out e-actions, the Broadbent Institute, other organizations have put out e-actions and other things. And so we really need people to get involved. Write to your local newspaper or in other areas. We don't have the resources that the other side has. We don't have nearly the same level of resources, but we do have the power of people. And that is so important. I mean, for the first time in decades, we're seeing movement. We're seeing some movement around the world and in other areas, and it's come because people have been out there. And when the pandemic is over, hopefully get out and demonstrate and be involved in those different acts.
I want to thank both Rebecca and Toby for joining me here today. Sochie and Senator Ramos, I thank them, of course. They've been pulled, for those who've joined late, both of those great activists and leaders have been pulled into a right now active budget debate happening at the state level, where really important decisions are being made that we didn't know was going to happen at this moment. And so they're out doing the hard work we're talking about right now, which is very cool.